So let's move on to step 2. At the end of each file for each step, I include the command line in Git that allows us to move on to the next step. But you can use, and this is what I recommend, all the shortcuts that IntelliJ offers to move from tag to tag. But in any case, if you're not using IntelliJ and you prefer to move around in GI, in Git, using the command line, you have that option. As for me, I'm going to load tag 2, so I'll check it out. This will load in the training or courses section in English, the folder for step 2. I'm going straight to the view file to see what is being asked of us in this step 2. And specifically, I read clean up the project, create a modular structure with 2 points. The first one asks us to create 3 folders, and the other to delete what was generated by Angular. A quick note on that, what you need to understand is that when we did an ng-new for our project, an access localhost, 4200, we already had something presentable at that URL. So that means Angular already generates something by default. It's simply to let us know that everything is fine, everything went smoothly during the application generation. Here is an app that's a bit of a placeholder, actually default content, but we really don't need this content. In fact, we need to delete it. The entry point of an Angular application is main TS. We're not necessarily going to dwell on that for now, because there would really be too much to say about it. But what you need to understand is that we're going to load our application onto app.component. This will be the entry component of our application, loading some configurations. We'll be adding quite a few configurations as we go further in this course. For now, we're not looking at it too closely because, to be honest, there are already some very advanced Angular concepts in there. What we're interested in then is to say it's this app.component that will be loaded by default. So it's very likely that all this data is in app.component. I'll go into it, and we end up with a file like this. This is a file that will be common to all the components we create. At first, it might seem a little confusing because we have functions that start with an @sign. We have TypeScript classes, especially if you're not too familiar with Java, since it already uses a bit of this notation. Or for example, with Vue.js or React. It's true that this notation is really quite specific to Angular. So at first it can be a bit off-putting, but then gradually you get used to it and end up being able to read it very easily. And actually you end up really liking it a lot. Just so you know, we call these decorators, whose purpose is you can think of them a bit like functions that add metadata, that add processing to a class they're placed above. So here we are saying that this class, app.component, is a component. It can be selected by an app-root tag, which we won't specifically use ourselves. It's Angular that uses it natively during its build process. We'll look at the build aspects much later. However, for the other components we'll create, we'll already be using this possible dependency imports, but especially for our part here. For our step 2, what interests us is this connection between the logic part, the class part, the TypeScript class part of this app.component fill on its HTML file, so it's visual rendering on the web, as well as the embedded CSS, meaning the embedded CSS style sheets used to display this HTML. So here we have our link that tells us for this app.component, load, the app.component.html. If I look in my file explorer, I already see a lot of things. And this is already where it gives us. So first we have a huge comment at the top that clearly tells us it's a placeholder, something that's meant to be replaced. So there you go, we go ahead and delete the entire comment. We can save and take a look at what happens. Right now we have a blank page. I left the router outlet. We could remove it. However, later on we're going to use routing very soon. It's going to be a mechanism that loads components based on the URL we're on. For now, we can remove it and simply see what happens. I can add an H1, my title, and see that it appears right there. What's interesting, but also very common with all somewhat modern frameworks, is that we have auto-reload. So you just need to save here to immediately see the result of what happened. So here, we've deleted everything that was automatically generated in HTML during the ng-new. If we look a bit higher up as well, there's also a TypeScript variable that was added. We can delete it. It won't necessarily be of any use to us. If we go back a bit to the training project, I suggested creating core, features, and shared. To create under, under app. Features and shared. We'll go over the purpose of this structure later on, but it solves a lot of problems, and in particular, it's very, very scalable for the future, especially for large applications. Even if we stick to just these 3 folders, we can do some very interesting things. So basically, that's what we have left. Well, that's what we had left to do for this second step. We can take a look at the final step to see what was suggested. So overall, here it is, creating this, deleting unnecessary HTML, and the variable in the TypeScript file. Since we deleted the TypeScript variable, we'll look at unit tests later, but it's true that we already had some auto-generated tests from when we did ng-new, which used this file. So for example, we can delete all of these things. So that's what we have. I've added some information here. Actually, I'm digressing a little bit. This isn't strictly about Angular, it's more about Git, but it's still interesting. What you need to know is that Git doesn't version empty folders, it only versions files. That means if you create a folder and try to push it without any files inside, Git won't see it and therefore won't share the empty folder. One of the little conventions is simply to create an empty.jitkip file, which doesn't really serve much purpose, but it tells Jit, especially when I did step 2, that there was at least one file, even if it's empty. So as a result, it's not that it knows, but it also pushes the core folder along with it. And so finally, a little bit of information as well about why we have this particular architecture. We'll see it in much more detail later on, but basically it allows us to have much more interesting scalability for our applications. Step 2 is done, still simple. The course will get more complex as we go along. So I suggest we move on to step 3 now.